What's up, everybody? I'm David Hain. Welcome to episode 235 of the A to D from Addict to Disciple podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, please like, subscribe, follow, and share the link with your friends. If you'd like to get our curriculum, you can get the paperback or ebook of From Ashes to Destiny on Amazon. Today's episode, again number 235 of the A to D from Addict to Disciple podcast, is entitled, I Can't Relate to That. I came up with this topic because people who start the curriculum or talk about other times they went to rehab or met with a counselor, went to AA, NA, whatever, they would say to me things like, it just wasn't for me. Or my counselor didn't understand. Maybe you said that topic or chapter just doesn't relate to me, so I didn't really get into that one. Or I couldn't identify with it. I've had people, as they start the From Ashes to Destiny curriculum, on the very first story say, they were talking about heroin, and I've never done that, so I guess that chapter wasn't for me. Well, if that was you, I want to challenge you, because when I hear that, I'm hearing words of denial, just saying I'm not that kind of addict, so this isn't for me. Or maybe underneath you're actually really saying, I'm not just ready for change, or I'm just looking for a quick fix to my problem. And I actually begin to get thoughts of, are you just going through the motions? Are you coming to rehab because someone else said you have a problem rather than you being able to admit to your addiction? So today, what I'd like to do is look at just the beginning of chapter 1 from Ashes to Destiny. I'm going to read the opening story of the chapter. As you listen, I'd like you to try to write down a few words or phrases that you can relate to, not for ways that you can't relate to it. And just as a heads up, when I finish reading it, I'm going to go back and point out 12 things that jump out to me that really everybody in addiction should relate to. You ready? Here comes the first story. I spent countless hours with Doug in an abandoned home in the Segundo section of Philadelphia, PA. This is part of the larger area known as the Badlands. Doug had many opportunities to see he was powerless over his addiction to heroin. His twin sister overdosed and fell out of the back door of the abandoned house right in front of him. No, her death was not Doug's wake-up call. Neither was his massive loss of weight, the open and festering sores on his legs, or the news that he was HIV positive. Doug still felt that he was in control. You see, Doug's role in the heroin community of El Segundo brought him the acceptance he needed so desperately. As the dark-skinned child in his family, Doug always felt rejected and not as good as his lighter-skinned siblings. Heroin became his escape from the emotional pain of low self-esteem and feeling unlovable. But with heroin, one bag is too many, and 1,000 bags are not enough. It is impossible to match the euphoria of the rush of the first bag, and before you know it, you're physically addicted. Doug was soon shooting up more than a bundle, 13 bags of dope every day just to feel normal. Many nights as I prayed with Doug in his room in the abando, he talked about feeling trapped in his life of addiction with no way out. It's like being in a room with hundreds of doors, but you can't find the doorknob on any of them, Doug said. Or it's like being at one of those highway intersections with the cloverleaf exit ramp. You can see the lanes to get off of the highway, but it looks more like a tangle of spaghetti than a chance to get your life back, he continued in despair. My wife and I saw Doug's powerlessness too vividly one afternoon as we were driving him to Teen Challenge Rehab. Doug had completed 5 days of detox and agreed to go to Teen Challenge for a year. As we drove across the intersection of Germantown Avenue and Broad Street, Doug reached over and grabbed the steering wheel. "Take me back to El Segundo," he screamed in a voice we had never heard. "I can't do this," he cried out. "But Doug," I pleaded, "I know you can make it." I heard my wife Shawn praying in the back seat. As I yanked the steering wheel to avoid hitting another car, Doug reached over and turned off the ignition and pulled out the keys. Shawn was crying and pleading with Doug to give God a chance, but the power inside of him was relentless. "Take me back to El Segundo or I'll walk there," he yelled. Doug stormed out of the car and hopped onto a SEPTA bus going south on Germantown Avenue. The voices inside his head would soon be home in his abando. Doug finally hit rock bottom and admitted his powerless. It was a slow and hard process after decades of addiction, but he made it. Doug is still living in Philadelphia, and you can find him in church every Sunday praising Jesus. Okay, so that's the opening chapter, first story. So the first sort of page and a half of From Ashes to Destiny. And did you find anything that you could relate to? Did you write some things down? Here's the 12 that I typically discuss with guys when we read that first chapter. Number 1 is Doug talks about his wake-up call. And we all have a wake-up call or hundreds of wake-up calls that other people around us think maybe they'll come right this time because that should be the alarm clock going off in their head that they're really powerless. So I want to ask, what was your wake-up call or some of your wake-up calls that you've ignored? Number 2, Doug felt rejected because he was not the light-skinned child in his family. He was dark-skinned, and everyone else in his family was light-skinned. So what are ways that you have felt rejected? Doug didn't feel not as good as his siblings. How about you? How did you feel in regard to your siblings? Did you hear words like, "You'll never be as good as your brother," or "You'll never be as good as your sister," or what have you? Or maybe not as smart or as handsome or as pretty or whatever it is. Number 4 is the phrase escape emotional pain. And for Doug, heroin became his escape from his emotional pain. Like low self-esteem or feeling unlovable. So what became your escape from your emotional pain? And what was your emotional pain? Then the next point, number 5, says 1 bag of heroin is too many and 1,000 is not enough. And I want to ask you about your drug of choice. When you hit that one drug that really became your comforter, was 1 too many and 1,000 not enough? And Doug found quickly that he couldn't match the euphoria of his first rush, of his first high. Have you reached that point with you where you're just not getting the high out of your drug of choice anymore, but you're still doing it? With Doug, number 7, there was no high, and he was just doing heroin to feel normal because it was the only thing that would take away his withdrawal pains. So are you at that point where you're not even getting high anymore, but you just go back again and again to your drug of choice because it makes you feel normal? In number 8, Doug felt that he was trapped and there was no way out. He talked about being in a place with hundreds of doors and no doorknobs, or on a highway and no exits that he could find for him. So what keeps you trapped or feeling trapped in your addiction, and that you've just sort of resigned to the fact that there is no way out and maybe you'll just always be an addict? Number 9, Doug felt powerless. And in his powerlessness, it came out vividly in what happened when we were driving him to Teen Challenge. And I want to ask you, what ways have you felt powerless? And at the same time, for number 10, there was this power that Doug felt inside of him that was relentless. And I want to have you think about, yes, we felt powerless and powerlessness in our addiction, but at the same time, we knew there was this power inside of us every time we got high. And I want you to be able to think about, journal that, talk about that power sort of from the dark side that you would feel well up inside of you. The power to control and manipulate and deceive people, whatever it might be. Number 11, Doug had voices inside of his head that were soon to be home when he returned back to the abando where he would get his next bag of heroin to shoot up in the shooting gallery. So what are the voices inside of your head that keep drawing you back to your next high? And maybe they're not voices for you. Maybe they're intellectual thoughts where you're rationalizing, I'm not an addict. I'm just doing this for pleasure. And finally, number 12, Doug finally hit rock bottom. So I want to ask each of you, have you hit rock bottom? And what did you do when you hit rock bottom? Did you come to your senses? Did you hurry off to get help? Or did you get stuck there? Like getting stuck in mud. For some of you, maybe you hit rock bottom and opened a trapdoor and just got deeper into your addiction. So there you have it. 12 topics for contemplation, meditation, prayer, journaling, discussion, whatever, just from the first story in the first chapter of From Ashes to Destiny. And I guess the key is, if you're starting a new curriculum, if you're starting this book, whatever you're at, start with the belief that addiction is addiction is addiction. Don't be quick to say, I can't relate to that. Instead, reread the assignment. Listen again to the podcast. Dig deeper and find points of connection. Thank you for listening to this episode of the A to D From Addict to Disciple podcast. Hopefully you were saying that's me as you listened, and so if you did, I want to encourage you to reach out now and join a group or find people to connect with. You can message me on the link in this podcast or by email at davidfromatod@gmail.com, or go to my website www.fromatod.org and click on the contact page. Tune in Monday for our next episode, and as always, stay safe and stay resilient.